Hello everyone and welcome to this month's Support Coordinator webinar, proudly brought to you by Endeavour Foundation. I'm Vicky Gray and I'll be your host for today's session. Today we delve into NDIS legislation changes, securing support for additional impairments, with our guest presenter Mary Ingerton from Support Coordination Academy. As we gather online with attendees joining us from across Australia, I'd like to acknowledge the significance of the lands we all call home. If you'd like to honour the traditional custodians of the lands you're logging in from, feel free to share their name in the chat. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gubbi Gubbi people, traditional custodians of the land on which I'm hosting from today. In the spirit of reconciliation, Endeavour Foundation acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Now, a quick note on housekeeping. Your microphones and cameras will stay off, but we'd love for you to join the discussion in the chat. If you have any questions for our presenters, pop them in the Q&A section and we'll answer them after the presentation. You'll also find a link to our privacy policy in the chat, so feel free to reach out if you have any questions about that. As mentioned earlier, during this webinar, we'll dive into the topic of NDIS legislation changes, securing support for additional impairments, with our presenter today is Mary Ingerton from Support Coordination Academy. But before handing you over to Mary, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Shania Brennan. Shania is Endeavour Foundation's Business Improvement Specialist, leading a team of social workers and disability specialists who advocate for our clients. With qualifications in psychology, HR management and social work, plus 8 years in the community sector, she's passionate about empowering vulnerable people with choice and control. Over to you, Shania.
Hello everyone, and thank you, Vicky. So as always, it is really wonderful to be here with you all today. As Vicky mentioned, my name is Shania, and as you know, today we'll be talking about securing support for additional impairments for participants. And I'm here to talk to you a little bit about how Endeavour might approach this. So I've got a bit of information on the slide there for you to follow along today. So I guess the overall focus of how we as a service provider would deliver or provide supporting evidence around a participant's support needs is very much focusing on the functional impact that their disability has on their daily functioning. So some of the types of supporting evidence that we can provide, and I know that I've spoken about this before, but I thought it would be a good opportunity to bring it up again. So some of the things that you might expect or could ask for from a service provider are incident report registers and progress notes, personal health or risk management plans, including the annual CHAP, complex support needs assessments, individualised rosters of care and quotes, individual support plans or care plans, and high intensity support logs as well. What I really wanted to do before I kind of wrap up and hand over to Mary, though, was to talk about a really wonderful story that we were able to support a participant with around their funding. And I guess it really encapsulates that focus around evidencing impact instead of just talking about an overall disability or a primary disability. So we were able to support a participant in regaining some self-funding that was originally taken away. So you can see the snapshot on the screen, and we were able to, so overall, we supported a participant who'd been living in their home for over 10 years and had been supported one-to-one 24/7 as this support was best suited to meeting their needs. So the NDIA made the decision to reduce this funding from one-to-one 24/7 down to, and they said that he could share his supports with one other person. So unfortunately, when that decision was made, his accommodation wasn't conducive to being able to share with another person. There was only, you know, one bedroom for him and one bedroom for the staff member. So there was unfortunately discussions about what would that look like for him. And yeah, so his support team, being his support coordinator, his allied health team, and Endeavour as his service provider, we were able to wrap around him and provided a whole lot of supporting evidence that really demonstrated the impact that his disabilities did have on his daily functioning, really focusing around that functional impairment. And with the wraparound approach and really strong evidence, we were able to support him in having that funding reinstated, which was just incredible. And everyone was so very, very happy for him that he got to continue to live within his home and be supported by the people and the service providers that he chose. So that's just a little story about how we've been able to support somebody that we do support within our services. And a bit of a snapshot about how we navigate this space as a service provider. So before I hand you over to Mary, I'd just like to give you a super quick snapshot of how Endeavour Foundation supports people with disability. So as you can see on the screen, we have lots of different pathways. So we offer employment pathways to help people build skills and confidence. We've got our supported home and living options and our community services that help people learn, connect and grow and do more of what they love. So if you would like to learn more, please just complete the form that will be posted in the chat now, and somebody from my team will be able to be in touch. So now I'm going to hand over to Mary, who is going to take us through the rest of today's presentation. Thank you, Mary.
Hi everyone, thanks very much, Shania. That was a great example. We often hear support coordinator funding being pulled from NDIS participants, especially around SIL and stuff like that. So to know that with really good evidence and really good reporting, we can actually get that put back in place. That's amazing. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about NDIS legislation changes. We're really going to focus around how do we support participants that we're working with or participants that we come in contact with about getting additional impairments added to their NDIS profile. Okay, here we go. Right, so we're going to be having a look at, okay, we're going to cover like the nature and the purpose of impairment notices, what this legislative change means in practical terms, the evolving responsibilities of support coordinators and adding additional disability diagnosis and impairments. So I suppose the reason that we're focusing on this today is that it is quite a shift in the way our support coordinators need to be aware of how to gather evidence and what we need to be focusing on. Okay, something also just to note, when I talk about or talk about participant in a general term, I'm also referring to that person's extended, you know, whoever that might be, that person within their life that supports that person to make decisions, because it could be a nominee, carer, parent, or whoever that might be. So just acknowledging that before we start. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so background to the NDIS legislation changes. So we're just going to start with some context and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty. So obviously the NDIS review in 2023 highlighted inconsistencies and confusion around access decisions being based on a disability diagnosis alone. So it recommended greater clarity, transparency and participant-centred decision-making. So the review emphasised that the NDIS should prioritise assessing a person's functional limitations and support needs rather than relying on a primary or disability diagnosis. By focusing on the functional impairment, the NDIS aims to implement improved assessments of individuals with multiple diagnoses and impairments and ensuring that they receive the appropriate support needs based on their overall disability-related support needs. So looking at that more a holistic focus. How does that impact on a person within their home, within the community, within social settings? So this shift, the aim of the shift is to move away from the current practice of categorising disability or types of disabilities as primary or secondary, and instead focusing on the individual's holistic support needs. So there's a link there to the NDIS review. So I'm assuming everyone would know about the NDIS review. If you haven't, really, really important that you go in there, have a really good read, because it's influencing all the recommendations out of the review, are influencing the changes that we're seeing under the NDIS and the future direction of the NDIS. So the shift is also important as the NDIS is moving away from a system that broadly equates diagnosis with need, instead actually identifying the actual barriers to participation and independence. So it's quite a different shift, yeah? So this actually means that support needs are more personalised, recognising that impairments differ even within the same disability diagnosis, which allows plans to be tailored to each person's unique support needs. So that was a major recommendation from the NDIS review, and really identifying that just because someone had the same disability diagnosis doesn't mean the impact of their impairment is the same. So for support coordinators, it's really focusing on this might be the diagnosis, but what is the impact? How does it impact on that person based on where they live, who they live with, who they associate with, the supports that are in place or the supports that are not in place? So it also empowers a participant to have clarity around which impairments the NDIS has granted access. So they get a lot more, that's in relation to the impairment notices. So as it directly relates to the supports that the NDIS would fund on a participant's NDIS plan. So if you think about it, a disability diagnosis links to a related impairment, which directly relates to the barriers that a person experiences, and the supports that are allocated on a participant's plan are allocated to support the participant to overcome those barriers and achieve their life goals. Okay, hopefully this is making sense. I'll give you a bit of an example. So say a person has a spinal injury, they are likely to have a physical impairment because they experience barriers in being able to move or control parts of their body independently, including a reduced level of stamina and resilience. Yeah. So you can see, even though they might have a spinal injury, the impact is how does that impact on that person? The person would likely require a wide range of assistive technology or equipment to support mobility, independence, and participation in daily life. The specific needs will vary depending on the nature, severity, and impact of the impairment on the individual's functional capacity and ability to complete daily activities both within their home and in the broader community. So the NDIS will also take into consideration the other supports the person may have access to, as in informal supports. So do they have family, friends, cultural connections? Are they socially isolated? What does that actually look like? They will be exploring the supports available within their broader community. So what are the supports that they're already linked in, or what are the supports that they can be linked into? Also mainstream services. So as a person linked in with mainstream services, so like health, are they getting rehabilitation? So if someone has a spinal injury, are they still within a rehabilitation unit, or are there spinal outreach teams? So it's about looking at it more from a holistic perspective. Okay, I'll keep moving. So for those who have seen quite a few of my webinars, I like to set context, and also need to be thinking about, well, how does this change in the legislation actually impact on the way that the NDIS look at the access criteria? And because we need to understand the disability access criteria. So when we're talking about the access criteria, there's three criteria. There's age, residency, and disability. So they're the three criteria that someone must meet to get access to the scheme. So in relation to the disability access criteria, when we are working with a participant, and if we identify that they have an additional impairment or disability diagnosis gets made with a related impairment, we only need to provide evidence in relation to the disability access criteria, not all the other criteria. So not age or residency, because they've already met that criteria. Okay. So as support coordinators, what we need to be understanding around the access criteria, with the disability access criteria, is there's four areas within that one criteria that we need to address, and it can become quite complicated, but I'm just going to spell them out to hopefully they'll make a bit more sense. Because I suppose what I find is people often say to me, but they've got a disability diagnosis, surely, if they've got that diagnosis. But then I talk to them about, well, how does that relate to an impairment? What's your evidence around likely to be permanent? And where's your evidence around the reduced functional capacity? So there's actually 4 separate areas. Okay, let's have a look. So the first one is, if we break down the disability access criteria, the first one is in relation to disability diagnosis. So the term disability relates to an impairment of body structure or function, a limitation of activities, so the tasks a person does on a daily basis, or a restriction in participation, so the involvement of that person in their life. So accessing their community, being able to maintain their home, all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of when the NDIS think about a disability diagnosis, that is the impact. So the disability is directly related to an impairment. So that's number 2. So when we think about a disability diagnosis, what impairment does that relate to? So when we talk about impairment, it's the impact of a person's disability diagnosis is evident by the barriers that a person faces and their reduced functional capacity to complete daily activities. So when we're thinking about impairments, we think there's 6 impairments, related impairments that the NDIS has identified. So an intellectual impairment, a cognitive, neurological, sensory, physical, or psychosocial impairment. So when we're thinking about psychosocial impairment, it's not in relation to the diagnosis could be a number of mental health conditions which relate to a psychosocial impairment. So a psychosocial impairment means how those mental health conditions impact on and create barriers for that person on a daily basis. Okay, so the impairment is likely to be permanent. This is in relation to permanency, and this is really, really important. I often get support coordinators saying to me, but they have a disability diagnosis and it's permanent. When the NDIS looks at permanency, it's not in relation to the disability diagnosis, because often a disability diagnosis is permanent. It's the impact. It's in relation to the impact of the impairment. So when they talk about permanency, they talk about the impairment is likely to be permanent, requiring lifelong supports from the NDIS. So likely to be permanent relates to the permanency, so it's enduring, and ongoing, which is lifelong, impact of the impairment, not the disability diagnosis. That's really, really important. So the impairment might be permanent, even if the impact changes over time. So if you think about psychosocial, there might be some, good days and bad days, but it's about the lifelong, and it's likely to be impact on the person lifelong. So there are disability diagnoses that the NDIA acknowledges that will likely result in a permanent impairment, and are things like an intellectual disability, autism diagnosis, and there's a list. So if you look under the operational guidelines for access, there's a whole list of disability diagnosis. But for other diagnoses, the NDIA need to acknowledge an impairment is likely to be permanent. A person needs to evidence that all available and appropriate treatment options have been pursued. So clinical, medical, therapeutic, assistive devices, life changes. So basically, but also that a treating professional has provided evidence that there are no further treatments available that could relieve or remedy the impact of the impairment. So I'll give you a really good example. Say you were working with someone who has an intellectual disability, which is clearly permanent on the scheme. However, when you start to work with them, you really start to notice that there are other issues. There might be some challenging behaviours, or there might be some other behaviours or things that are happening that are clearly, it's not in relation to the intellectual disability, and it might be in relation to a psychosocial impairment. So in order for the NDIS to acknowledge this additional impairment, they would need evidence of a diagnosis evidence of the related impairment. How does that impairment impact on that person? The barriers that the person faces, and that's generally how you evidence the impact, but also what is reduced functional capacity, but also that the treating professional, so it could be like a psychiatrist, psychologist, they would need to evidence that they'd provided treatment over a period of time, that they'd trialled it, what the outcome of that treatment was, and then clearly stating that we've trialled everything that is available or is appropriate for this condition, and that there are no further treatment options available. So that's what the NDIS need in relation to permanency. It's quite complicated, but it's actually quite specific. And then the last area is significant functional impact. So these are the domains that we as support coordinators would be aware of already. So it's about what is the substantially reduced functional capacity that impacts on that person and creates barriers. And it's in relation to one or more of these domains. Does it affect their communication? Does it affect social interaction, learning, mobility, self-care, or self-management? Okay. Right, I'm going to move on. Hopefully that's all making sense, because we need to understand this to be able to understand the next part of the section. Okay. Right. Let's have a look at the support coordinator role. How are we going for time? Pretty good. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, that when support coordinators are initially working with a participant, it's essential for support coordinators to gather comprehensive information to understand the individual's unique support needs. So what I'm going to talk about here is it's a bit of a process that I talk to support coordinators about all the time when first starting to work with a participant, because what it does is it helps us to set up a context, really understand that person's situation, understand why they're on the scheme, gathering all that evidence, because that really helps us to set a bit of a baseline, but it also helps us to measure any progress that's been achieved, but also it helps us to identify where there's gaps in support needs or that their support needs have changed. Okay. So the foundational understanding enables a support coordinator to collaborate with a participant in developing a clear and tailored action plan as well that outlines specific steps that support coordinators will take in relation to supporting them to achieve their goals. So once we have this foundational information, we've gone through the bit of this process, and this is often the process that happens, as part of that initial planning and gathering information. So assessment, planning, gathering information, it's a constant process that we do as support coordinators. Okay, and then once we've done that planning, we often then develop action plans that provide evidence around what's the information, what's the situation, what are the actions we're going to take, what are the priorities, what have I agreed to do, what are the stakeholders going to do. It really helps to set up that agreement and transparency about what we do as support coordinators. Okay. So step one, gathering foundational information. So when starting to work with a participant, it's really important that support coordinators collect evidence of the participant's disability diagnosis and the impact of their related impairment. So it helps us to understand how the impairment impacts on the participant's daily functioning and creates barriers to participation and independence. So it really helps us to really understand that person's unique situation and how that impacts on that person on a daily basis. So I'll give you a bit of an example. So if a person has been granted access to the NDIS with a diagnosis of, say, chronic depression and an anxiety, this is likely linked to a psychosocial impairment. The support coordinator should explore how this impairment reduces the participant's capacity to engage in daily life activities such as lack of motivation, routine and structure, emotional regulation, or even barriers in accessing their community. Okay. So the next part is then identifying and assessing functional impact. So the support coordinator must have the skills to gather and interpret the evidence that explains how the participant's impairment affects their daily life. So taking the time to explore the impact of a person's impairment, when we're doing that initial planning and information gathering. So things like, does the participant struggle to start or complete tasks? Do they fatigue quickly, affecting their self-care or household tasks? Are they socially isolated or overwhelmed by leaving the house? So a support coordinator also needs the skills in relation to reviewing and interpreting clinical documentation. And these are things like occupational therapy, functional capacity assessments. So being able to draw information out there that really informs that reduced functional capacity and barriers, impact of that impairment, or it could be like a psychiatrist or a psychologist report. Understanding how the impairment creates barriers to participation and independence and relating these to significantly reduced functional capacity domains. I find it really, really helpful to set that baseline. So what are those domains? How does that impact on that person? And really listing the domains and then identifying. I always put that in my reporting because that really informs any progress that's been achieved or any deterioration or any changes to that person's support needs. Again, setting a baseline and having that evidence to measure progress or any changes against. Okay, number 3. Connect the functional impact to life goals. So with a clear understanding of the participant's impairment and its impact, support coordinator needs to support a participant to explore and articulate their life goals. So we're not just talking about the goals that are on the participant's plan. That can be a really good starting point because it helps you to have that conversation. But it's about being inquisitive and saying, well, what do these goals mean to you? Or if you were to achieve these goals, what would that look like? So really understanding what they mean to the person, where are the gaps, what are the supports that are already in place, but also what would that look like if we were like to work towards that goal or pursue that goal? What would that outcome look like? It really helps you to measure the progress. Assisting a participant to understand how their impairment creates barriers to achieving these goals. So really then breaking that down to, so what would that look like? What are the steps that we need to be putting in place to support you to achieve that goal? And identifying the supports required to reduce and overcome these barriers to enable the participant to pursue their goals. So I can't stress enough the time that we need to be spending around that goal development, because it really informs everything else that we do. And then, okay, step 4, explaining the link to funded supports. So this whole process really helps us to unpack that plan and help to explain it in that person's context, so that building their capacity to understand those NDIS processes. So the support coordinator then can assist a participant to understand how the NDIS funds supports, so that understand how the NDIS funded supports directly relate to the impact of their impairment. So identifying the supports the NDIS is likely to fund based on the participant's unique needs and reduced functional capacity, while also exploring and connecting them with broader community and mainstream services to build that, that resilient network and sustainable support network around that person. So I kind of explained earlier about how that links. So when we unpack the goals and we understand the barriers and the impact of that impairment, that should directly relate to what's being funded on the NDIS plan. Yeah. And so it really helps to explain to a participant about what is that funding for and what can it be used for. And we talked earlier about what would it take, what are the actions or the supports or steps we need to be putting in place to support you to pursue that goal. That's what that funding's for. And then we can link in those community supports as well as those mainstream services as well. So when thinking about that scenario that we used earlier for a person with a psychosocial impairment who experiences barriers related to lack of motivation, say routines, emotional regulation, or being overwhelmed when accessing the community, the NDIS would likely fund supports that assist that person to overcome these barriers. So they could be support coordination to navigate NDIS systems and link into relevant supports and services. Could be support workers to assist with daily living and tasks, household management and accessing their community. Could be something like psychologists to help with emotional regulation, anxiety management and therapeutic strategies. Could be an occupational therapist who has a mental health focus to help develop routines, life skills, and to build functional independence. So hopefully this helps you to really understand how this all links together. Okay, so it's also essential for a support coordinator to educate a participant about the responsibility of each service system. So then this is part as that interface between the NDIS and other service systems. And really helping them to understand what the NDIS doesn't fund. So really helping them to explore and understand the difference between what the NDIS can fund and where we can access supports and services from mainstream supports or community services. Okay, support coordinators also, one of the other fundamental things that support coordinators do is build and work collaboratively with that support network. So aligning those supports with the impact of the person's impairment and disability related support needs and focusing on promoting that meaningful participation and increasing independence. Okay. All good? Move on. Okay. So we've talked about the changes to the NDIS legislation, the impact on the access criteria, what support coordinators really need to know about that disability access, especially when we're gathering evidence. And then we talked about the process that support coordinators go through and setting up that process really well and doing that intensive planning and information gathering and assessment and documentation and setting that baseline really helps us again to identify any gaps in support needs or really helps us to be more aware when changes are happening. Okay, talk about that. Here we go. So let's have a look at identifying gaps and additional impairments. So the NDIS have talked about from January this year that they would be sending out notices of impairment, which will clearly state what impairments are identified on a participant's profile. But when we start working with participants, we often see gaps in their support needs. We might see changes in their behaviours or the way that they're coping with different situations, crises happen, impacts on the person. And so that's part of our role to be aware of these and linking in supports and services to actually get further assessments or get further information. Then again, that links back to the access criteria. So support coordinators often discover that a participant may have additional disability diagnosis or impairments beyond those that are initially identified by the NDIS. And sometimes that's a person has only provided focused on one disability diagnosis when they've provided access, or it might be something that has an acquired disability over a period of time. Okay, so say for example, you might be working with someone who has a psychosocial, some mental health conditions which are related to a psychosocial impairment, but they then start to develop some real cognitive difficulties around decision making or problem solving. So these functional challenges might indicate that there might be in a presence of an unrecognised cognitive impairment. So say we're using that situation. This is a bit of a situation that I've been working with in relation to my social work role. So have an additional disability diagnosis and or impairment recognised by the NDIS. Again, participant must meet the NDIS disability access criteria only, not the residency and the age, just the disability access criteria. So again, as a support coordinator, you would need to be gathering evidence around the diagnosis. So a formal disability diagnosis from a qualified health professional. It needs to be linked directly to an impairment. So documentation that clearly connects the diagnosis to a related impairment. So that is it cognitive? Is it in relation to physical, sensory? All of this information is in the operational guidelines for access. How does that relate to permanency? Is the evidence that the impairment is likely to permanent and requires ongoing support from the NDIS, and including documentation of all the treatment options that have been trialled and that there are no further options likely to remedy or reduce the impact of the impairment. Okay, and again, remember that the impact might be fluctuating, but it's still going to be lifelong. Okay, and then the reduced functional impact. So reduce the evidence showing that the impairment causes a substantial reduction in functional capacity across the life domains. So again, being really clear about those 4 points when you're gathering evidence and wanting to present that to the NDIS. Okay, so what's the next steps? Once you've gathered that information, quite often it will be, well, if it's during the period of a plan, so it's in between you're not coming up for a review of a person's plan, then you would be submitting a change of situation and making a request to the NDIS that they acknowledge an additional disability diagnosis and impairment and get added to a participant's profile because they require additional support needs. So that would be requesting additional diagnosis or impairment acknowledged, provide evidence to the disability access criteria, all those 4 points that we already covered. So once that would be approved, that would actually go to the access team. They actually review that information. They'll let the planner or the LAC know if they need additional information, but generally, if you follow those 4 criteria, that's pretty much what they're after. Once it's approved, changed, the notice of impairment is issued, and then as a support coordinator, we would have already gathered information around the additional support needs. So then you might be coming up for a review or whatever that might be, and then you're requesting additional supports in relation to the newly acknowledged disability, diagnosis, and related impairment. So if you think about it, you've got someone with a psychosocial impairment, and they might be those supports that we were talking about before, but due to the cognitive decline, they would be different supports. So they might have they might start to develop might need more support around occupational therapy, around that problem solving or organisation. They might need more support around, especially if there's a speech decline, and that might be in relation to processing or understanding information. So there might be need for a speech therapist to be involved. So hopefully I'm making sense. But basically, the additional supports are around addressing those barriers, the additional barriers caused by the additional diagnosis and impairment to support that person to achieve their life goals and reduce that functional capacity. Okay, a lot of information. Right, we've got some time for some questions. Okay, I'm going to open the Q&A. So just to let you know, we're going to try a different process this time. So Leilani would have been dropping questions into the Q&A. So I'm just going to scroll to the bottom. So what we're going to do, depending on how much time we've got, we're going to answer around 5 questions. And then what we're going to do is Endeavour will send me a whole sheet of all the questions, and I will write responses to them. And so, because what we've been finding, there's been so many questions we haven't been able to get answers to. And so then what Endeavour will do, they'll send out a post to everybody, an email to everyone to say, the recording is ready for you to go and access, and here's the questions, and here are the responses to the answers. So that's a new format that we're going to use going forward. So we're going to trial that to see whether that works a bit better. Okay, I'm going to start right down the bottom. Hey, Michaela. I have a query regarding gym pool memberships. If the participant's plan has a specific goal about them regularly exercising, could this be something the plan covers? Could I fill out the replacement supports form? Okay. Okay. What you need to come back to, Michaela, and what everyone should be coming back to is the reasonable necessary criteria. And we did a whole webinar on this. So what you need to be coming back to is the person's goal isn't about having a gym membership. The person's goal might be around increasing their fitness, increasing their strength and mobility through regular exercise and training or whatever that might be. So it might be access to a physiologist that might actually write a specific, often like a physiologist often do like a specific exercise plan based on that person, on the impact of that person's disability. So it's very focused around what they can do, what they can't do, designing that plan, and then maybe taking that to a gym. So the NDIA so say a person needs to go to the gym and they have an intellectual disability. The NDIA, my understanding is they won't be paying for gym fees, but what they would do is support that person to go to a gym with a support worker if they needed them to be able to access that personal trainer. So it's really thinking about what is disability related, how does that person's disability impact on them, what are the additional supports that they need to overcome to be able to go to a gym and have an appropriate program developed for them. That's what the NDIS funds, and then thinking about what's outside that. Hopefully that will make sense. Happy to discuss it further if you want to email me. My email address is on the slide. Okay. Can you update us re mandatory support needs assessment? When are they being rolled out and who will be doing them if you know anything? Kate, there's been a bit of information on it. There have been tenders being put out around assessment tools and software solutions and all that kind of thing. Haven't heard anything more about it. That was closed in March this year. We haven't heard a lot more about it yet. The aim was for that to be started, my understanding, by the end of this year, starting to gather some tools and starting to do consultations and stuff around it, possibly starting it to roll out next year. I'm not quite sure around the timeframes because we haven't had any updates around the timeframes. But it would always start with new people coming in as opposed to people who are already in the scheme. So again, watch this space. I think NDS, so National Disability Services, are often the best point to go and find out timeframes and when things are happening around that. Hey, Amanda, how do we gather foundational information if the participant doesn't have any documentation from the application process, if they have an intellectual disability and limited informal supports? Really good point. On the NDIS website, a participant can actually request information. I'll answer this question in the Q&A, but there's actually a part on the participant page on the NDIS website where a participant or a support coordinator on their behalf, if they've got consent, can request the access application, all the evidence that was provided, planning decisions around why things were approved or not approved. That's how you kind of get that foundational information. So the initial access criteria, what evidence did they provide to get onto the scheme? You know, what was the decision making around that approval? So that's one way to do it. Then the other information is from getting assessments. So if you have a person that comes onto a scheme with an intellectual disability and they've never had a functional capacity assessment done, then requesting a functional capacity assessment. If you've seen changes around person support needs, getting assessments done, gathering information from their support network. So what do we already know? Okay. Kim, just mindful of time. I'm aware that the NDIS can pick up on wording as well. Therefore, when I ask allied health professionals for reports, I ask them not to put the word treatment in their reports, as this alludes to the fact that the person will be miraculously cured of their disability impairment and that it is not lifelong. Absolutely. Are they able to use the word treatment now, meaning that it makes no difference to the NDIS? I think it's really thinking about the access criteria that I gave to you and the information in relation to the access criteria. So when we're looking at, I think what you're talking about is the evidence around permanency. Is it likely to be permanently? So does a person, is it enduring? So it's likely, the impact is likely to be lifelong. And is it, so the impact is likely to be lifelong and it's likely to be permanent. Is meaning, so it's meaning around, when we're talking about treatment, we're talking about, so a person has a disability diagnosis, and often disability diagnosis, the actual disability diagnosis is permanent. So they're always going to have an intellectual disability, or they're always going to have psychosocial impairment, mental health conditions. But the actual treating is of the impairment, the related impairment. How does that impact on that person? Is it cognitive, intellectual, psychosocial, sensory, neurological? So for example, someone might have I've used this example before, might be diagnosed with epilepsy, which is permanent. It doesn't just go away, permanent diagnosis. But the impact is able to be treated often with a trialing medication over a period of time to stop those seizures from happening. So it's really, when you're talking about treatment, you're talking about, you need evidence around likely to be permanent. So what has been trialed? How long has it been trialed for? What was the outcome of those trials? Did the person actually tolerate that medication change? And if not, then that trial wasn't effective. Are they trialing something else? And then the professional actually providing evidence that, or stating that there are no other treatment options available. So it's more around the permanency of it as opposed to the treatment. Hopefully that's making sense, Kim, and I'm picking up on what you're actually asking me. If I've completely got that wrong, please email me. Okay, 46. Can financial hardship be considered a barrier for a participant? Coral, I would need to understand the context of that. I find quite often participants or people with a disability have financial hardship due to the impact of their disability. I think financial hardship is the end result, if you think about it like that. It's more when you're thinking about the impact of a person's disability. So if someone has an intellectual disability, they might have challenges in relation to managing finances, or understanding when someone's taking advantage of them. So thinking about the impact, then how does that create barriers for them? And it might be if someone has problem understanding when someone's taking advantage of them, they might need additional support when considering buying contracts or signing agreements, things like that. So, or it might be around financial management. It's around, okay, so if they have, what's causing that financial hardship? So what is the cause? What is the impact of the disability and the related impairment? How does that impact on them and create their barriers, which results in financial hardship? So you actually need to do that front end, processing, gathering information, documenting, and then the impact, the end result is, or the impact is, they experience financial hardship. So hopefully the process that I talked about will explain that a lot better. Okay, I've got 10 minutes. So Yuli asks, are you able to send us the criteria like that all medical treatments were trialled and it is now a permanent disability? I will explain the access criteria, Yuli, in the question and answers in response to the information that I've provided. I'll put it in more detail in those responses. Hopefully that will make it. Again, all of this information is in the operational guidelines around access to the NDIS. Very, very detailed. Okay. Last one. Most participants have received the impairment notice. Does anyone have experience of how easy this is to get from the NDIA at the moment? Also, when people transition from state disability care support, it seems not all the information was as detailed as what the new legislation requires. Absolutely. Really, really good point. People are being asked to get autism assessments or being told they are old assessments, including their intellectual disability diagnosis. These are expensive to access, and we all know the wait lists are extensive, but is there any other alternative? Okay. Okay, so what Ron is talking about is when they set up the trials for the NDIS scheme, they gathered a lot of information. So it was all state-based, which then became federal-based into the NDIS. Every state had their own disability system, and then it became one federal system, which is the NDIS. So every state had their own system about how they captured people with disability who had gaps in support needs, had no funding or who had no supports. So within Queensland, we had a we had a whole list of people who had, it was a register of need. And with that register of need, we had our own criteria around the permanency of their disability. We had our own criteria around age and residency. But what actually happened is that criteria, those people on that register of need, or if they already had access to the statewide disability systems, they had automatically funneled into the NDIS without going through that access criteria. But what they found later on is the evidence that a state might have required is different to what the NDIS required. And so sometimes you will find is that the NDIS might have a diagnosis of evidence of a diagnosis of an intellectual disability, say, or autism diagnosis. What they don't have is evidence of the severity. So what level of intellectual impairment? Is it mild, moderate, or intensive? Is it what level of autism? Is it level 1, level 2, level 3? And what is the significantly reduced functional impact across those domains for that person? Yeah, because that helps them to then directly connect to one of those related impairments. Is it cognitive? Is it intellectual? Is it sensory? Is it neurological? What is it? So sometimes when I've found with support coordinators and they've come to me and they've said, I don't understand what the NDIS is asking for. Sometimes what they're asking for is, can you please go and get a cognitive assessment? Or that might be through a psychologist to actually gather evidence around the intensity and the impact for that person. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, right. Do you have a draft of a document to guide you through the 4 steps? I do actually have a draft of a copy of a document for that, and I'll put more information into the Q&A. Thank you very much. Got some amazing questions, and again, Endeavour will send those to me and I will write responses, and they will be up on the website for you to go and have a look at once you get the link when the video is ready for you to go and have a look at. Thanks very much, everyone, and I really appreciate everybody coming along.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mary. Once again, your information just blows my mind. You just have all this in your head, and it just, yeah, every time it's brilliant. I'm sure many of you will walk away again with new information and ideas to support your clients as well. As Shania mentioned earlier, if you have clients looking for supported employment opportunities, home and living services, or community support services, please reach out to our team. We've just popped the form in the chat, so you can just get straight to us and we can help your participants. As Mary mentioned, next week you'll get an email with the recording of today's session and the PDF of the presentation. I know a lot of people were keen to get their hands on that. We'll also have an additional resource to share with you, as Mary mentioned, where she goes into more detail to answer all of the questions from today's webinar. So please keep your eye out for your in your inbox, because we'll be sending that out next week. We'd also love to invite you to join us next month in September. Our next webinar, Kickstarting the Future, Empowering School Leavers Through NDIS, Community Supports and Inclusive Employment Australia, is on Tuesday, the 9th of September, at the same time from 12 till 1. And just before we go, we've also just shared the link to all of our support coordinator webinar recordings on YouTube. As Mary mentioned, there are a few subjects and topics in there that do relate well to what we've talked about today. Don't forget to subscribe so that you'll know when new videos are uploaded and ready to be viewed. And also, if you'd like to stay informed and support your clients even better, we've also dropped the link to our Care Connect newsletter in the chat. On behalf of Endeavour Foundation, thank you for joining us today. Wishing you a fantastic afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thanks again.